Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I have a guest with me. This is Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, who was my co-host for Jane Austen July, and we're going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice, which we both reread this year for one of the read-alongs. So this video is going to be full of spoilers, so don't stick around unless you would like to be spoiled for Pride and Prejudice / have already read it and know the story. So I think we've both read Pride and Prejudice many, many times. How many times have you read Pride and Prejudice?
I think this was my fifth time. I've read it a lot.
Yeah, I have no idea how many times I've read it. I think it's somewhere between like 7 and 10, but it could be more than that. Just in the last few years, listening to it on audiobook, I've listened to it several times because the audiobook is so good.
Yeah, the Rosamund Pike version is amazing. And so the past 2 years I've read that one. This time I actually read the audiobook and the print version at the same time, which has been a new favorite thing of mine to do.
I think now, even if I were to read the book in physical format, I've listened to that audiobook like 3 or 4 times. So I think I'd still have all Rosamund Pike's voices in my head.
Yeah, but that's not such a bad thing.
So Pride and Prejudice is definitely my favourite Jane Austen. Is it yours? I know sometimes you say Emma is up there as well for you.
Sometimes I say Emma, sometimes I say Pride and Prejudice. And to be honest, after this month reading both of them, I have no idea. Depends on the day. But Pride and Prejudice is always very highly rated, very highly. If not the top, then number 2 on any given day.
I do think it's just such a good book. And there are so many things I love about it. And I've now read it so many times that it's a real comfort read for being a book that I know so well as well.
Yeah, it's just like returning home. There's so much in it. And the best part is every time you read it, you get something different out of it.
Yeah, it's true, because I've read it so many times, but every time I read it, there's another character who I interpret a bit differently, or another line that I noticed that I didn't notice before. And I feel like as well, because all the characters are so layered and so complicated and so nuanced, so there's so many different ways to read them, that every time I read it, I have different interpretations of all the characters, which I love.
Yeah, I mean, this time my view on the different characters definitely shifted. Pretty much all of them, actually.
So I think one of the reasons why I love Pride and Prejudice so much and why it is so appealing to so many people is because of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, both as a love story, but also because they're such interesting characters as well, and such complicated characters too.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that most people fall in love with Pride and Prejudice, at least at first, for the love story between Elizabeth and Darcy. It's really interesting. Over the years, my admiration for that love story changes over time. I remember last time I read it, I had a lot of issues with Elizabeth and Darcy's relationship, and I took the ending to mean that they would not be happy in the end. But this time I felt differently. I actually think that they can overcome some of the obstacles to their relationship and that they will end up happy.
It's interesting as well because in general, when people read Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are so in popular culture as a couple that you know to expect them to be together, and you're always looking out for that from the start when you read it. And also I think because of the popular culture image of Mr. Darcy, it softens him. Actually in the book there are bits where he is quite rude, but I think because we have a certain image of Mr. Darcy in our mind from popular culture, we kind of let that go. But actually, I think one of the things I really like about Pride and Prejudice is the character development and the fact that actually they both have flaws, but they both help each other overcome their flaws and become better people. And maybe that means that they can have a really happy marriage after the end of Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that popular culture really does skew your view of Elizabeth and Darcy. Honestly, reading the book, I don't like either of them all that much. I like Elizabeth, I do, but I find that in popular culture, she's presented as much more outspoken, much more rebellious against the cultural norms of the time. And in the book, you realize that she actually is quite sensible, and she does adhere to her 19th century, early 1800s standards of living.
Yeah, I mean, the rebellious one is Lydia, not Lizzie. And actually, she rebels a little bit, but not too much, in a way that is allowed within the society that she lives in. And yes, she stands up to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and she stands up to her father at one point, but also she many other times criticizes her younger siblings for not acting with propriety, and she admits to herself that Mr. Darcy censures of her family and their vulgar behaviour basically is accurate and true. And there's kind of the suggestion at the end of the book that they're going to see lots of the gardeners, which are her refined relations, and not very much of the rest of her relations.
Yeah, and I think that throughout the book you do see so many instances where Elizabeth is just absolutely mortified by her family members. And certainly Mr. Collins at some point also translates as her family member. But her parents, her younger sisters, she is completely mortified and embarrassed by them at various points in the book. And I think that just goes to show how not rebellious she is. I mean, you're right, Lydia is the character who rebels most against society, and risks, you know, a bad reputation to achieve what she is looking for. And I think to some extent Lydia does that unconsciously. I don't think she's trying to rebel. I think in many ways she's actually trying to adhere to the standards that she perceives society has for her. She just kind of goes about it in a way that is misunderstood, I think, at least.
Yeah, I know we were talking about this before, how like actually, yes, what Lydia does is completely against society, and that she runs away with a man and lives with him before marriage. But the reason why she does this is because she is desperate to get married. Mostly because society has drummed into her, and especially her mother has drummed into her for ages, that the aim of women's lives should be to get married. So for Lydia, that's all she wants. And so she is kind of keen to attach herself to whoever shows interest in her. And she runs away with Wickham, and then she's very, very, very proud that she has got a husband, and especially so young. And she is incredibly young. You know, she's 15 at the beginning of the book, 16 at the end. So when you think about it like that, she is so young, and she just doesn't really, I don't think she always understands. And I think she is quite selfish, but I also think the way she's been brought up by society, and especially her mother, to think of marriage as the only important thing, leads her to kind of risk everything to achieve that.
Yeah, and this read along, I personally realized how much Lizzie embodies her father's qualities, and how much Lydia and Mrs. Bennet are so similar to each other. And in this way, I do think that Mrs. Bennet has instilled in Lydia the idea that marriage, no matter how it's achieved, is the end-all and be-all goal of a woman. And Lydia feels a sense of pride and accomplishment that she was able to get married before her sisters, without taking into consideration how she got married, the scandal she caused, the reputation that she possibly has. And in the end, I don't know if she feels like she is being punished, but she is effectively banished to Newcastle, to the north, where nobody knows her and nobody knows her history.
Yeah, and I think you can see how both Mr. and Mrs. Bennet affect how Lydia is, because Mr. Bennet, a bit like Elizabeth, is so keen to laugh at people. And I think people never quite know whether Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet are joking or not. So that I think Mr. Bennet has spent so much time like saying his youngest daughters are silly, that they basically just ignore him. Whereas if he had taken a more kind of middle line, they might have listened to him, because he does criticize their behavior, but he criticizes it like it's a joke, which means that they don't really take him seriously. And he isn't able to do anything about their behavior or bring them up in a way that could help them, as he has Elizabeth, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely.
I find Mr. Bennet a really interesting character, because I feel like I vary every time I read it between whether I like him or whether I think he's horrible. And I can never decide whether I think he is funny and has a nice, like, joking relationship with his wife, or whether he is just absolutely horrible to her. And I never really know which way to read it.
Yeah, I think in the past I've read Mr. Bennet as a much nicer character than he really is. This read along, I found Mr. Bennet to be a much less sympathetic character than in previous reads. I think that his relationship with his wife can be seen as a joking, teasing kind of relationship, but when you think about how Mrs. Bennet really doesn't understand that he is making fun of her, it almost comes across as cruel. And I think also on this read, I began to understand that he does actually feel remorse for the situation he has let his family fall into. This whole estate is entailed on a son. And at what point was he going to realize that they weren't going to have a son, and that the future of his daughters was in jeopardy?
Yeah, I definitely think you see him regretting the situation. And I wonder if as well, like, one of the reasons why he is so keen to laugh at Mr. Collins and to make fun of Mr. Collins is because Mr. Collins is danger, Mr. Collins is the person who will turn all his family out his house. Maybe his coping mechanism is to laugh at him. And I think you see as well that he does regret after Lydia elopes with Wickham, and he very much feels that this is partly his fault and that he has not educated his children correctly and that he has not looked after his children well enough.
Yeah, he regrets it, but at the same time, he doesn't even take any action in that situation. He, sort of gives up. He comes back home and he lets the uncle, Mr. Gardner, take care of everything for him. And so even though he regrets his past misactions, he doesn't step up in this situation and help his family. It ends up being really effectively a stranger, Mr. Darcy, unbeknownst to him, who solves the family's dilemmas.
Yeah, and when he thinks it is Mr. Gardner who has paid lots of money to Wickham to make him marry Lydia, he feels guilty about it. But once he learns that it was Mr. Darcy and that Mr. Darcy did it partly out of love for Lizzie, he's like, oh, well, it's basically fine then. And I do think it's a book that has amazing character development for quite a lot of characters, like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, but I feel like Mr. Bennet is a character who doesn't really learn.
Yeah, he doesn't learn, but in some ways he learns to regret who he is in all of his actions, but he doesn't change them. He doesn't actually grow with what he does. He just grows with what he thinks, which is profoundly sad because now he just generally loathes who he is and what he's done in the past, but makes no actions or attempts to redeem himself, which is a sad character arc.
I was also looking out on this reread because I've recently read a few Pride and Prejudice retellings, The Other Bennet Sister and also What Kitty Did Next. So I was reading Mary and Kitty a bit more closely. The Other Bennet Sister is a retelling of Mary's story, to kind of notice how much they are or are not in Pride and Prejudice, and how you can see them as characters and how they have grown beyond Pride and Prejudice in their various sequels and retellings. Yeah,
and I haven't read What Kitty Did Next, though I've heard from you that it's quite good. But I loved reading Mary on this reading. The Other Bennet Sister was amazing when I read it, but having reread Pride and Prejudice and paying attention to some of the details regarding Mary, I'm even more in love with The Other Bennet Sister. I feel like Janice Hadlow was able to take these really tiny sentences that I've never even noticed in the book, just these one lines, and create entire divergent plots that explain those sentences and really explore themes in Pride and Prejudice that I never even imagined could be explored.
I think another thing I was thinking about, so in both The Other Bennet Sister and What Kitty Did Next, both Kitty and Mary in those stories have been it feels like they've been let down a little bit by Elizabeth. Elizabeth could have been a better sister to them or could have been there for them more or had more in common with them than she might want to think. And I feel like that has also made me look at Elizabeth differently. It's quite odd when you think that there are 5 sisters and they so separate off into little groups, and Elizabeth and Jane are so close but have so little in common with the younger girls, and then Lydia and Kitty are a unit and Mary is just completely left on her own. And I think it's interesting to think about how complicated those sister relationships are, and at what point in their childhood they separated off in that way.
Yeah, the family dynamics in Pride and Prejudice are very interesting. You definitely see a division between the elder 2 sisters, the younger 2 sisters, and then just you've got Mary kind of in the middle, and the interactions between those different factions of the family are few and far between, really.
Who are your favorite minor characters, do you think?
Probably Caroline Bingley, Georgiana, the Gardeners, of course.
I do really like Caroline Bingley, and I think she's really interesting because I think she's one of those characters who I read differently every time I read it, and sometimes I think she is all meanness and just a horrible, horrible person. And sometimes I read her slightly younger or slightly older, and I think the younger I read her, because her age is never specified, and when I read her as being a 18-year-old, I think of her more sympathetically than when I read her as being 22. And I think as well, there are a few moments where she basically goads Mr. Darcy on in what she says to him in order to force him to admit his admiration for Elizabeth, though the only person that affects is her and it hurts her, but she does it anyway because she kind of just self-sabotage in a way that makes me feel a bit sorry for her sometimes too.
Yeah, I think this reading was the reading that I had the most sympathy for Caroline Bingley. And I think you're right. We don't find out her age in the book, and there are different theories as to what her age is. But I do think that the younger you read her, the more sympathetic she becomes. When she's younger than Lizzie, it seems that she is jealous of the attentions that Darcy is giving to Lizzie, and she, you just feel bad for her, wishing that that was her. But the older she gets, the more you feel like she is just out to sabotage Lizzie and to take Darcy for herself, despite not really feeling for him. Just she's after his money, and she is quite snobbish towards Lizzie.
I suppose that's the thing. Do we think that Caroline Bingley is after Mr. Darcy because of his money, and she dislikes Lizzie because Lizzie doesn't have money? Or do we think that Caroline Bingley is properly in love with Mr. Darcy, and that knowing Mr. Darcy is a bit of him snob himself, the easiest way she thinks to push Lizzie out of the way is to focus on that towards Mr. Darcy?
I don't think she really loves Darcy, personally. Not that I have much to back that up right now, but I do think what she does like about him is what Lizzie doesn't like about him, that she likes his snobbery, that she likes his status and his class position. I don't think it's necessarily all about the money, because Caroline Bingley and the Bingley family in general does have a considerable amount of wealth. But what they don't have necessarily is status in the same way that Darcy does, because they are in some ways new money. I think in the beginning of the book this time, which is something I didn't notice before, Bingley has come from a family that has made a fortune but does not own land. And he's not really looked down upon for that, because I guess times are changing. But having money but no land, no title, in a position of Caroline Bingley, you would be looking for somebody who's not only wealthier than you are, but someone who has that prestige in society, who has that class status.
I think that's very true. And she's sort of really eager to unite their family with Mr. Darcy's, whether that is through her or through her brother and Georgiana.
Class-wise, status-wise, uniting those two families makes sense. Certainly elevates her and her family. And, the only other match that would be more beneficial for Darcy's family would be to unite the different branches of Darcy's family, in his marriage to Anne. Do you think Caroline really loves Darcy?
I don't know. I'm not sure if I do. I think a lot of the time I don't, but every now and then I think she does. I think the bits where she there's that bit in Derbyshire where she just basically says that Elizabeth is ugly just because she knows that Mr. Darcy is going to reply and say he doesn't think so. I feel like there isn't any explanation for why she does that, unless it is just kind of putting herself through emotional struggle. I don't think there's a sensible reason why she would do that. She knows by this point that he thinks she's really beautiful. If she was going to pick something apart rationally, it would be to do with her class or her station, but she doesn't. She picks on Elizabeth's appearance, and I feel like she does that out of proper jealousy. I don't think it's just about the money, but I don't know, because I think on that as well, every time I read it.
Yeah, I think she thinks she's in love, but I don't think she's in love. I think she's convinced herself that she's in love because of class, because of money, because of reputation. But if you really think about the two characters, they don't go together so well, and she doesn't truly love who he is. She loves who she thinks he is.
I can imagine if they did get married, then it would make Mr. Darcy so much worse. All his worst qualities would have been brought out by Caroline Bingley.
Absolutely.
It is really interesting, the different gradations of class and rank in this time, and how many different levels there are within it.
Yeah, absolutely. So many characters in this book are of the upper classes. Actually, are all of them pretty much in the upper classes? Is anyone not gentry?
The gardeners are upper middle class. I guess Mrs. Phillips is upper middle class. I guess Wickham and people are officers in the army, are sort of, they're not gentry, more middle.
So we see this wide range of upper classes in the book, yet there's such discrepancy in class. I actually think maybe that's why I like Pride and Prejudice and Emma so much. I feel like the two of those books really have the most gradations of class.
It's very interesting, the massive difference between Elizabeth and like Mr. Darcy and Lady Catherine de Bourgh, because Elizabeth's father does own land, and the bit where she talks to Lady Catherine and she says, he is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter, like we're equal, but they're also, the difference in like wealth and station between them is vast. Yeah, her family are very much, in the scale of gentry, they are fairly near the bottom, and Mr. Darcy is incredibly wealthy and owns, a massive house and massive grounds, and that does put a big difference between them. And also then we have again like the Bingleys, who have new money, but they have quite a lot of money. So in one way, like the Bennets have been gentry, or Mr. Bennet has been gentry for longer, but then the Bingleys have a lot more money. They have enough money to buy a very big estate if they want to. And then also, of course, Mr. Bennet has married Mrs. Bennet, who I think is an attorney's daughter, so she is middle class, so that kind of affects their family station as well.
Yeah, and I think the audacity of what Lizzie says to Catherine de Bourgh is really bold, and I don't know if all modern readers pick up on that, but yes, they're both, she's a gentleman's daughter, he's a gentleman. However, there is such a huge class discrepancy there that even though that statement is true, it does not mean that they're equal in terms of socioeconomic status at all.
Yeah, and I think like it's interesting that so much of it, to what it means to be a lady or a gentleman, is not just about the socioeconomic stuff, but it's also about like behaviour and culture. So we know that like when Mr. Darcy objects to Elizabeth's family, it's not so much about the fact that they don't have that much money, or that her aunt and uncle are like in trade, or her uncle's in trade. It's also about like the vulgarity and like want of propriety of her relations. It's also about like culture and how people behave, and who has like the cultural capital. And for example, like we know that Mr. Hurst, who Mrs. Hurst is married obviously, he is described as being like a man of more fashion than fortune. He's very fashionable and very high society in that sense, but he doesn't have that much money, but he considers himself above like the country society.
Yeah, Mr. Hurst is actually a really interesting minor character, and I never pay attention to him much while reading, but he is quite obnoxious as a character, because like you say, the way he carries himself, the way he acts is not quite representative of his socioeconomic status, and many of the characters do not look upon him fondly when they discuss him.
Yeah, and he seems to only really be interested in sort of cards and playing cards, and him and Mrs. Hurst seem to live at Mr. Bingley's expense at least some of the time. But because he has that like fashion and that cultural capital, even if he doesn't have as much money, he still has like the class, and that ends up mattering more in some ways. It's interesting, there's at least like one bit, I can't remember, when they're in Rosings, where it says like that Mr. Darcy looks ashamed at like his aunt's ill breeding, because she says something which is also a bit rude. And actually Lady Catherine's quite an interesting character, because she is incredibly wealthy, she is titled, so she has that like massive socioeconomic status, but she also at times doesn't have much propriety either, and actually were she to have much less money, she wouldn't be as respectable, but she has like enough money that she doesn't have to be proper, whereas it's so much kind of worse within society that the Bennet family are not all proper because they don't have quite as much money.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Lady Catherine de Bourgh, it's really interesting because she is not a model of propriety. She's actually quite rude and quite annoying, and I feel like people only respect her because she has so much money. I mean, Mr. Collins practically worships her, and everyone defers to her in society. However, Darcy is in the position where he can actually evaluate her as a person rather than for her money, and I think that's also what makes Lizzie's interaction with Lady Catherine de Bourgh so astounding and so brave and bold on Lizzie's part, because she does not have that class status. She doesn't have that entitlement to be able to truly tell Lady Catherine de Bourgh what she thinks of her. Lady Catherine is not accustomed to hearing that kind of honest discussion about her person and her personality from somebody who is of a lower socioeconomic status. And it really appalls her, takes her off guard, and she finds it rather rude that Lizzie feels that she can actually speak her mind. When in reality, if Lady Catherine was in a position like that, she would speak her mind to anyone and everyone because she feels like she can, due to her economic status.
I guess another like big theme throughout the book is marriage, both in terms of like that being the ending of the book, but also in terms of the marriages we see throughout. And I know you and I were talking before about how like Elizabeth and Darcy are well suited to each other in their temperaments, but also they are likely to have a happy marriage, or happier certainly than like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, because they both are attached to each other and because they're like equal in terms of affection, even if they're not technically equal in terms of rank and status.
And I think the entire book is representations of people who do get married because they are looking for socioeconomic status, they're looking for a house, or they're looking for wealth, or they're looking for a better reputation in society, but they don't really factor in the actual character of the other person they're marrying, with the exception of Jane, perhaps, and Bingley, of course. But Lizzie and Darcy, Lizzie's first rejection of Darcy is because of their inequality of affection. Darcy suddenly loves her, but she hates the man, and even though she would be mistress of Pemberley, and that would be wonderful, and she would raise her sisters up in society a bit and get them better marriages, she can't do it. She can't live with such an odious man, or as she perceives him, in order to gain those benefits, because she's seen how there are so many unhappy marriages where the affections are just not equal. And then, of course, by the end of the book, the reason that they're able to marry despite her initial rejection is because they aren't agreeing to a financial agreement the way most marriages looked upon, but they're agreeing to a social agreement. They're agreeing to love each other and be happy together.
Yeah, so there's that bit at the end as well where Elizabeth is asking permission to marry Mr. Darcy from her father, and her father says, my child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. And I think it's really important that like her father is warning her against that, because that is his marriage and he doesn't respect his wife, and he never can, and that would make him miserable, so he has to laugh at it, which actually, when I think about it like that, I feel bad for Mr. Bennet, though I do think he's mean to her sometimes, but it's like it's important that respect as well as love and like understanding is what Jane Austen is arguing is like so central to a marriage. And we see the unhappy marriages where there isn't respect and understanding, like the Bennets. And also I suppose we have the Collinses, who like maybe they will be fine, but they're mostly going to be fine through trying to spend as little time with each other as possible, which is quite sad as well. Yeah, and then we have Lydia and Wickham, who Lydia is infatuated with Wickham, but I'm not sure she loves him because she doesn't really know him. And Wickham is attracted to Lydia, probably, but not much more than that.
You get a sense that Lydia and Wickham's relationship is not going to last long term in terms of their affections for each other. I mean, Lydia is taken with Wickham, and Wickham, I don't actually know if Wickham quite loves Lydia. His reasonings for running away with her is to escape the debt that he's accrued in his current position in the current town, and that's his way of leaving. And he figures, well, Lydia's basically throwing herself at him. He may as well run away with her. And I don't think he ever intended to be with her long term.
No, not at all. I think he just thinks Lydia is slightly attractive. I think that is all that there is on his side. Yeah, the way Lydia is described and how quick her attachment to Wickham is, although she is very fond of him at the end of the book, the impression is that she probably won't be forever, and then I feel like they're not going to have a very happy marriage at all.
Yeah, no, I don't see them being happy long term. But Mr. Collins and Charlotte are very interesting, actually, because I think we see in the book that the way that they're going to achieve marital bliss is to ignore each other, and that is not such a great foundation for a marriage, of course. But the different interpretations of Mr. and Mrs. Collins, you end up seeing how people read what's in Pride and Prejudice and, imagine different things for them. Imagine that, Charlotte enjoys that's what she wants. They also imagine that, maybe at some point they will learn to respect each other.
I suppose as well, if the issue is sort of equality of affection, then Mr. and Mrs. Collins have an equality of affection in that they don't have very much for each other, but they're on the same page. Like, they both have married because they wanted to get married and to marry someone rather than because they wanted to specifically marry each other, which I think in some ways they are going to have a better marriage than Lydia and Wickham, for example, because their marriage is based on practical things and those practical things won't go away. So although I don't think they're going to be like as happy as Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, maybe they will be fine, because they do have that, like, they're on the same level, in that they're both slightly indifferent to each other, and maybe that means they'll be okay too.
Yeah. It's possible, but I think some of the best interpretations of their relationship, and certainly in the other Bennet sister, they question whether they are both really indifferent. I think one of the best parts of the other Bennet sister is how they, Janice Hadlow explores Mr. Collins's feelings, and how, Mr. Collins is young. He has entered into this relationship. Why has he entered into this relationship? Is he truly practical? Does he believe Charlotte will be a good homemaker, or does he want something more out of his marriage? And I don't think that that's explicitly clear in Pride and Prejudice at all. But if he does want something more out of his marriage, if he wants a partner, if he wants love, if he wants respect and mutual affection, he isn't really going to find that in Charlotte.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I do love that bit in the other Bennet sister. And I do think it's really interestingly done. I guess some of the other important themes of the books are like the themes that are in the title, as in the Pride and the Prejudice. And I know, like, I've read some readings which say, Mr. Darcy is the Pride and Elizabeth is the Prejudice, but I also think both of them have both of them as well. And then it's quite interesting to see how, like, assumptions about people and, like, first impressions and quick character, like, assessments affect the plot and affect how people see each other, and how, Elizabeth's first impression of Wickham, she trusts him blindly just because she assumes that he's nice, whereas she assumes that Mr. Darcy is proud and doesn't like him. She assumes that Mr. Darcy is all wrong and bad and Mr. Wickham isn't, basically because Mr. Wickham, when they first meet, flatters her and gives her attention, and Mr. Darcy ignores her, and that kind of leads to the way she sees both of them for quite a while. And I feel like it's interesting how so much of the book works on, like, changing opinion of people as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was originally called First Impressions for a reason, but I quite like thinking about how Pride and how Prejudice interact in the book. And yeah, I don't view one character as all Pride or the other as all Prejudice. I think that the book in itself is about how you view someone the first time you meet them, and how that may not actually reflect who they are. Whether that's you see a ton of, pride in them, or have prejudice yourself, or, vice versa.
And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why, like, Pride and Prejudice is so rereadable, because you're like constantly invited to, like, question your prejudices about all the characters and to question what you think of the characters. And I feel like every time I read the book, I'm like all the rest of the characters, learning to understand each other more.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I love Jane Austen in general. I think that's the case with all of her books, but it's most the case with Pride and Prejudice, and I think that's what keeps it as such a timeless book, and as a book that resonates with everyone, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know I said this before, but, like, I understand why people don't like Dickens, though I love Dickens, but I genuinely don't understand why anyone doesn't like Jane Austen, because I just can't understand how you couldn't enjoy Pride and Prejudice.
I think the only way I understand how people don't like Jane Austen is if they can't get past the language. If they can't understand what's happening because they can't get into the language.
Yeah, no, I do get that. But yeah, I feel like Pride and Prejudice is fairly accessible, and more so than like, I think Mansfield Park is a bit less so, probably.
I think as far as the language goes, Pride and Prejudice is probably the place to start. Yeah, I've been trying to get my husband to read a Jane Austen book. I really want him to read Emma or Northanger Abbey, because there are characters in there that really remind me of him. But I, of course, want him to read Pride and Prejudice because it's probably my favorite. So every time I read him little snippets or passages to try and entice him into reading the book, he just says, "You're reading it too fast. I'm not understanding the language." And I think that, just given a little time and a copy of the book, he would get over that pretty quickly.
I think everyone can enjoy Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, and if the language is difficult, I think watching an adaptation first can help.
Yeah, I think so. And the story is so like in popular culture that I feel like it's not like you're going to spoil yourself by watching an adaptation because you probably already knew the ending anyway.
The only thing I always think about that is if you watch an adaptation before you read the book, you might have perceptions of characters that you don't quite realize come from the adaptation rather than the book itself. But if it means you'll never read the book unless you watch the adaptation, then it's worth watching the adaptation first.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that's all we wanted to say. So yeah, do let us know down in the comments if you also read Pride and Prejudice in July and what you thought of it. And if it was a reread, what did you read differently this time around? I always think that's really interesting. Definitely do go over to Marissa's channel if you haven't been there before. And I think that's all. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.